This is not all about narcissism or just self-focused kind of stuff. No, this is about loving ourselves properly. And when we do love ourselves properly, as we do develop this harmony, we are able to love others so much better.
What are mother wounds?
When we're young, we're not well equipped to cope. There's a part of me that wants to get everything done, and there's a part of me going, why can't you just relax? Why can't you chill out? Part of the reason why the part is stuck there is because of usually it's some kind of traumatic, painful thing. They're also holding strong emotions attached to that the system has said, whoa, we can't handle that because they haven't been processed or whatever it is.
I wanted to transition a little bit to movies because I think it's another great way of understanding parts work. Welcome to the Restored Podcast. I'm Joey Pontarelli. If you come from a divorce or a broken family, this show is for you. We help you heal your brokenness, navigate the challenges, and build healthy relationships so you can break that cycle and build a better life. My guest today is Dr. Gerry. He founded Transformation Counseling and Coaching. He authored Litanies of the Heart, Relieving Post-Traumatic Stress and Calming Anxiety Through Healing Our Parts. He's a therapist with experience in trauma and anxiety disorders. Dr. Creed is trained also in internal family systems and ego state therapy. He's also an EMDR certified therapist and consultant. Dr. Creed worked with individuals, couples, and families, and he teaches at St. Vincent's Seminary in Latrobe, Pennsylvania. Growing up, Dr. Gerry experienced deep turmoil at home. His father was abusive, and his parents' marriage was just full of conflict. When they eventually did divorce, even though it was his dad who left the home, he really felt like he lost both parents, and as you can expect, that left him feeling really alone, so he became very independent. Now, thankfully, he found a lot of healing, and today he helps others heal as a therapist. In this episode, we discuss how his family's dysfunction and his parents' divorce affected him and how he healed, how internal family systems and parts work can help you heal and improve your relationships, how our parts interact with our significant other, boyfriend, girlfriend, spouse, and how to avoid choosing a spouse from a wounded part of you. Really important part of the conversation. We talk about what a mother wound is and how it affects you, and how movies like Inside Out and Kanto and even the Avengers movies illustrate parts work and the healing journey. And so if you perhaps have sustained a mother wound or you want to find some healing using internal family systems, this episode is for you. In this episode, we do talk about God and faith. If you don't believe in God, you're totally welcome here. Anyone listening for a while knows that this is not a strictly religious podcast. So wherever you're at, I'm really glad you're here. If you don't believe in God, my challenge for you is this: just listen with an open mind. Even if you were to take out the God parts, you're still going to benefit a lot from this episode. With that, here's our conversation. Dr. Gerry, it's so good to have you on the show. I've been wanting to do this for a while. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
I want to start with maybe an obvious question, kind of a deep question, which is, why do you care so much about helping people and helping them heal?
That is a big question. I mean, I think some of it goes back to my own childhood and my own upbringing, and even, having, had different kinds of trauma, different forms of abuse as a child, different parents, splitting up. They're very difficult relationships sometimes there. And, and yet at the same time, discovering some resilience, obviously, but also discovering God, discovering my faith, exploring that, being able to heal to some extent through communities, through working with people, and the experience of growth, if you will, and healing, and my own life and my own journey, still not done, still quite imperfect. But nevertheless, the journey has led me just in wanting to help people, and, to whatever extent that I've experienced the love and healing of God, and also often through people, I want to impart that too. So a big part of my desire to help others is partly because of the grace that I've received. So that's informed it. And I think some of that is just who I am and who God made me. Like, there is an aspect of just my own personality, my inner workings that, I'm fascinated by, right? And I have there's parts of me that are very intellectual and want to research and write, and I love that aspect of me. And then there's another parts of me that are more relating, right? Want to care about connection, care about relating with others, and like to see people connect and grow and really have healthy relationships. So some of that is just values that are kind of embedded in who I am as I've discovered myself.
Love that. Yeah, I remember hearing, I think, John Eldredge say something like, he's a counselor by training, but also by intuition. And you very much so hit me as like someone in the same vein, which is beautiful. You mentioned that your parents split. To whatever degree you're comfortable sharing, like what happened there, and how did that affect you? Especially because everyone listening right now, comes from a dysfunctional family, divorced family, separated family.
So my parents had a very unhealthy relationship. My dad himself had a very traumatic childhood of his own. And, when he got married, he was a very kind of like, I would say at this point, like a broken person, but he was abusive. So I have, pretty serious father wound issue there. And so in fact, my parents would fight. And, I can even recall many times their fighting was very frightening, for me as a child. And so in that process too, I probably like idealized my mother a little in that, but because she was the parent who was the responsible one, she was a parent who was nurturing, she was a parent who was, reliable. So at some point I can remember wishing my parents were divorced. Like
Yeah.
There was so unhappy, there was so much turmoil and chaos in the home that I kind of please end it and that kind of thing. In the case of in my situation, my mother, she worked as a secretary, she worked as an administrative job. She wasn't highly paid or anything, but she was always had a job and she was security. Whereas my dad was always losing his jobs or different, was not reliable in that way. And I just thought, well, what what do we need him for? Like in a way, like can't we get away from this pain and all this stress and everything else? And eventually there was kind of a big big event that happened that was, where he left. I don't know how much you want me to get into my story. This isn't my therapy session or anything, but he left. And so that was in early high school, I think. But then there was the issue of my mother going through depression, her going through a lot of stress and disconnection. So in a way, when my parents divorced, there was a sense in which I lost both parents in that. And this was me in high school. So,
wow.
So I understand the experience of divorce, but I know it's different for different people. For some people, it's losing a parent that they were attached to. In my case, there was a sense of both, like I was wanting a relationship with my mom to continue, and it felt very disrupted. So I felt very alone, actually. And probably the refuge for me were my friends. I had a girlfriend at the time. But I also think that through that, I just became very independent. And I figured I have to, solve things on my own and do things on my own if anything's going to happen, if anything's going to change. In a way that's good and in a way that's bad, right? Like I learned that sort of a good thing to be independent in a way, but it was sad because it took me a while to learn that I could trust people.
No, thanks for sharing all that. And I definitely have felt similar with the whole independence, like quality, where in some environments like the business world, that independence is like very valuable, very good. And then, but in relationships, like you said, it can be make things really difficult. I've definitely experienced that in my dating relationships, friendships, and especially within my marriage. And so, yeah, I definitely relate with you on that. And yeah, I can relate with you too on the side of losing both parents. It was a similar situation with my family. Details were different, but dad left and, mom was left to kind of take care of everything. And it was just too much, like you said, for her to just do it all. And so naturally us kids got neglected. And so, especially because I was really attached to my dad, that was like a major loss for me. And, I loved my mom too, but she was just so occupied and busy that it was definitely a tricky situation. And that's where, like, you said, you kind of, as a kid, you get this feeling that like, well, it's just like me against the world. Like I better figure it out because no one's really got my back. And so I'm going to have to, just kind of press forward. And we've seen that a lot with the young people that we serve as well. And so, yeah, I can relate on so much of that.
Yeah. I think that, not that I didn't make some mistakes or do some things that I regret, but I did end up kind of finding in that process, if you will, a relationship with Christ. And I did find a relationship also in community, in faith communities, even in high school. So that was kind of life-changing, I think, for me, because I feel like if I didn't have that, it would have gone in a very different direction my whole life. And so I'm really grateful. So even though I guess I feel kind of like abandoned, I suppose, by parents, God provided. I had to be willing, I had to be open, but he was providing for me things that I needed. The other element of it is that being open to whatever suffering, whatever pain that one experiences, and being open to how that in God, in Christ, can be transformed for good. So to get back ultimately to the question you asked me initially about like, why do I want to help people? Like there's a sense in which, well, when I help, if I'm working with people, like I'm a counselor, right? So if I'm helping people resolve wounds and hurts and their mother wounds or father wounds or whatever traumas from their life, there's a part of me that feels like I'm being a vehicle for that. And so God is working through me to make a positive difference. And so much of my ability to empathize and understand and make sense of, connect with, is partly because of what I experienced. So I feel like God can use those things. Sometimes we don't see that when we're younger. Usually it takes a while for us to recognize how, our suffering can be redemptive. It can be transformative.
I couldn't agree more. Yeah. I think it's important to say that because sometimes when we're stuck in the midst of it, it can feel so overwhelming. We can feel swallowed by it. We can feel like, it's senseless and there's no purpose to it. But it's almost like we're stuck in the middle of a story. And I know we're going to get into stories and movies a little bit later, but we're literally like in the beginning or the middle of the story. We haven't really seen how it ends yet. And, if you leave a movie early or stop reading a book in the middle, you're not going to see the resolution. And I do believe maybe life is messy and there's not ever maybe perfect resolutions to everything, but there are resolutions. I firmly believe that. And I've seen that in my own life too. And one of the resolutions for me has been that, there's been especially men in my life who have mentored me and kind of stepped into that father role, kind of making up in many ways for what I lacked at home. And so, I have a good relationship with my dad now. I love him. And but if I'm honest, there were definitely certain ways in which there was like a deprivation there. And so, but yeah, it's cool to see. And it's cool that I love seeing, how you're using something that was painful to you. You've grown from it, and now you're using it to help other people to empathize and all that. So good. And one thing I wanted to mention too, for everyone listening, sometimes the young people we work with feel some level of guilt for wanting their parents to get divorced, like you had mentioned. And I think one of the most helpful things on this topic has been just understanding that there's two categories of divorce. And I know you know this, but for everyone listening, Dr. Paul Amato is at Penn State. He's a sociologist there, and he's done a ton of research on this topic. And basically says typically marriages that end in divorce fit into one of two categories: high conflict or low conflict. High conflict is what you might imagine, like what you were describing, Dr. Gerry, of like, there's a lot of just visible dysfunction, there's bad fighting, there might be abuse, violence, things like that. And in those situations, the children do benefit from a split. Maybe it's temporary to allow some healing to happen. Maybe it's so serious that it needs to be more permanent. But that accounts for about 30% of divorces, according to Amato. And on the flip side, you have low conflict, which is situations where, from the kid's perspective at least, and I should have said that with high conflict, the kids like kind of observe it all, they're privy to it. In low conflict, the kids are kind of hidden far from it, or at least it's more covert. It's hidden from their eyes. They kind of assume and think everything's fine, even if they have like an idea that maybe things aren't perfect, things are kind of dysfunctional. It's not to that same high degree. And so when a divorce happens in those families, it really comes out of the blue. It really, hits them in the back of the head, and they're like, wow, I never saw this coming. And so I found that to be really helpful to understand that there's those two major kind of categories. And, in the high conflict situation, it makes sense that someone would want to get out of that. And in the low conflict, it makes sense that someone would just say, my goodness, this was just like taken out from underneath me. Like, who will I be able to trust? Like, if this thing, my family, which was supposed to be the most permanent, the most foundational thing in the world, is taken from me, like, what's not going to fall apart in my life?
No, I like what you say there, and I think that's an important distinction. I've grounded a little bit around security too. So if you have a relationship, a parental relationship, a family that feels secure to you, and then suddenly you find out, oh, my parents are having a divorce and I had no idea, that is a sudden trauma, because it's like, I thought I was in a safe place and all of a sudden I'm not. Whereas the high conflict example you gave, maybe since as long as they can remember, there has always been insecurity. So you go from insecurity, which is your normal, and wanting the divorce feels like moving to security in some level. I mean, maybe not perfect security, but at least better than what was there. So that, I don't know, for me, that's how I kind of frame it a little bit, is around that safety and security.
Yeah, no, that's a great way to frame it, because there are so many variables. And, I think that model that Amato gives is like helpful, but there's, it's like every model, there's imperfections in it. So I really like what you said about that. And maybe we'll have to do a whole nother show on that topic of like attachment theory and everything, because it's such an important topic. But yeah, thank you for going into all that, for sharing. I want to pivot a little bit to talk about the type of therapy that you do with parts work. And so starting out, to someone listening who has never heard of parts work and parts, like, what do we mean when we're talking about that?
The whole idea of parts work, and the most well-known at the moment type of parts work, is called internal family systems, IFS. There's other models that do exist and have existed. But this type of therapy is recognizing that within our mind, if you will, within our heart, if you will, inside us, there's a multiplicity, or there are different parts. You could say sub-personality maybe, but there's different parts that exist in a sense, and or at least phenomenologically exist, and they represent different parts of us. And so if we treat the human being, the human person, like they're just one thing, like your personality is just one thing, I think we are missing a whole lot. And once I learned about multiplicity, about the fact that we have different parts within, and you start working with your different parts. So the therapy is about connecting inside, looking inside, discovering all these different parts. And this is not talking about multiple personality disorder, anything like that. That's an extreme disorder of one's parts, but we naturally have different aspects of self. And so one way I would look at it would be like, they're a part of me as a manager more type of part, who's going to be super good with getting work done. I'm task oriented. That shows up for me it may be in a job, shows up for me around the house, maybe if I am organized or whatever. So I have a part that's task oriented, right? And when you meet that part of me, if he's a little bit focused, he's going to be not paying very much attention to you, and he's going to be wanting to get his job done, possibly, as an example. But I have another part of me that, hey, is kind of chill and just wants to hey, I want to just relax, smoke my pipe and watch, a movie and just chill out. Well, that's a different part of me that if you encountered him, this aspect of me, then you would have a very different impression of who I am, right? So you could say there's different roles, right? So my parts have different roles. So that, I don't know if that gives you some sense of what parts are. But when you're working with people, we recognize that these parts, a lot of these parts I just described, like manager parts or this other more relaxing, chilled out part, they are often protecting. They have roles, but they're often protecting. And one of their jobs, especially the manager ones, is to protect us from being overwhelmed by pain or shame or fear or any emotion, or maybe a very disturbing memory or whatever. They're protecting us from being overwhelmed as a system. And what we learned is that when you look past those protective manager awesome parts, but when you look past them, we have other parts that we call exiles. And those parts that they often show up, if you connect with them, often they show up as children or adolescents. Not always, but most of the time. And it's because those parts are kind of stuck often in time, if you will. And so, or developmentally, they're still in the place they were. And part of the reason why the part is stuck there is because of usually it's some kind of traumatic, painful thing. And so those exile parts are holding those difficult memories, if you will. And they're off. But what can happen, though, is they're also holding strong emotions attached to that the system has said, whoa, we can't handle that because they haven't been processed or whatever it is. And so we got to exile it and keep it away. But it's really just being tucked in our unconscious mind. And when we're not conscious, all this is going on, but something happens, right? Maybe somebody says something unkind to me, or somebody says something happens, something bad takes place or whatever, that triggers those exiled parts. And then they suddenly show up in some way by flooding my system. And those emotions are connected to sometimes those past things. And so my system is flooded. And so then I have other protective parts that will leap into action to shove that back, right? And that can be anything from alcohol consumption or drug consumption. It can be anger, or rage, or something. It can be can just be numbing out in some way, binge watching TV, binge video games, whatever. These are all reactive things to, whoa, keep that exile at bay. Meanwhile, we have other parts of our system with the role of being a manager to make sure that never even gets to that point. So anyway, the point I'm making is that we've got this whole little system going on inside. And the parts work therapy is about connecting with and helping all these different parts within us. They're all parts of you, they're me, right? And helping them be healthy, bringing those exiles home, loving them and giving them what they needed, helping those protective parts do their job in a healthier way. And then what happens in the end is, or in the end, it's an ongoing thing for most people, but we develop this inner harmony. Our inner system is healthier. Our inner family, if you will, is a happier, functional family. And until I learned about parts work, I feel like I never quite got there often with clients because there's always something not addressed. And now I'm able to address so much more in this kind of work.
I love that. So much there. So much there. I love what you said about the kind of exiled parts of you being stuck in time. I remember hearing a little bit about kind of how the brain works in trauma and how when you go through a traumatic event, the logical side of your brain, at least the two-part brain theory, says that logical side of your brain that's, calculation and language constricts and the emotional part takes over. But that part of the brain, at least with this one theory that I'd heard of, it doesn't have a sense of time. So literally baked into our neurobiology, at least the science that I had learned, there's literally that part of you that's stuck as a 10-year-old kid, as a 12-year-old kid. And it might show up in an argument with your boyfriend, your girlfriend, your spouse. I'm curious kind of in that realm, especially with relationships, because that's a major pain point for our audience. How do these parts, especially the exiled parts, maybe typically show up in relationships and cause maybe problems? I don't know if that's the right term to use, but cause some conflict or cause some lack of harmony within the relationship. If you, like me, come from a broken family, you've probably experienced a lot of difficult emotions, and it's easy to deal with them in unhealthy ways. But one healthy habit that's helped me, working out consistently and eating how my body was made to be fed. It keeps my body healthy, and the endorphins help me feel happier and better navigate tough emotions. But I know it's not easy to start exercising or to be more consistent with it. You might be thinking, I don't know what I'm doing. I have no time. I'm too unmotivated. That's why I trust and recommend Dakota Lane. He's a nationally certified fitness and nutrition coach who's helped 1,000+ clients, from beginners to even pro athletes. As a devout Catholic, he creates personalized fitness and nutrition plans with 24/7 support and one-on-one coaching. And since it's all online, you can literally work with Dakota anywhere in the world. One client said, Dakota changed my life. His program is worth every penny. If you've struggled to change yourself for the better, Dakota is your man. To see what Dakota offers, go to dakotalanefitness.com. Dakota is actually giving away for free his PDF guide, The Biggest Fitness Mistakes to Avoid. Just click the link in the show notes.
Yeah, it's a whole topic, and it's a great one. I'll mention a few things just come to mind that there might be issues that come up. Here's the thing. Part of this whole notion and this understanding is that we have a core self. I would say inmost self. Use St. Paul's language, but we have an interior self. Even in the secular world of internal family systems, they identify a self as somehow different from parts, but it's sort of the core spiritual center of the personality. I have come to see it as the best representation of the image of God within the soul. So we have this inmost self that is the best, most representation of who we are at a deep level as a beloved child of God. All right, so I just want to preface that we have this self, okay? And that what happens is our parts are more like busy, if you will. They have tasks and their roles, and like I was describing. And they're managing life, if you will. And so what can happen is that a part that is burdened with something, right? Either maybe it's a belief like I'm not good enough. So let's say if it's a manager part, that task manager that I was talking about earlier, let's say not only is he the task manager, like he's busy doing stuff because we need parts that do stuff, but he's burdened with this belief of I'm not good enough. Well, then what's going to happen to his role? Like he's going to be more like having to prove himself, always having to do more, having to prove myself, blah, 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 prove, right? And the way we would see that is that part is blended in, or that part is like eclipsing, if you will, our core inmost self, right? And so when we're in a relationship with somebody, what are we encountering in their personality? Well, we might be encountering a part that has a burden, and it's covering up in a way, sort of riding the bus, if you will, and we're not accessing our core spiritual center of who we are. Or maybe we are a little, it's not always a perfect thing. Like it's a little bit like a cloudy day. Some sun gets through sometimes, but it's dominantly being covered up. So when we have a manager part that is coping or whatever, or maybe we call the other type of protectors, some of them firefighters. So we have manager, types that are proactively doing things, and we have firefighters that are like busy putting out fires, right? They're reacting. And so one way to react is to isolate. So we may have a part that just isolates away, right? So I know I do. Like I have had parts that are task managers, and I've had parts that will void and isolate and just go off into my own little hobbit hole, right? So if you talk about relationships, so whether it's in my case, my wife or
Sure.
anybody, are they encountering me, the busy task manager who doesn't believe he's good enough? Or are they encountering primarily the me that is the avoiding all bad feelings and wants to just hide away? What version, if you will, of me do they meet? Now, another thing that could happen would be if my exile part, my little abused, all alone child who's been hurt, right, and wounded, that exile, I mean, sometimes that part is the part in charge at times, shows up. And so that would be a wounded victim, if you will. So what happens when somebody else has, let's say I'm a 20-something-year-old single guy, and with my sort of background, and I meet some girl who's also around that age. She's got a part that is also kind of a manager, task manager type, like go-getter, but who believes she's not good enough with that burden. So she believes she has to help everybody else in order to feel good about herself. That's her burden. That's the part that's showing up for her. She encounters and say we have some night, we meet, we're on a date, and then we stay all night till 2 a.m. talking because I have let my exile be the one that's in front. So she's meeting my woundedness, and she wants to take care of, she wants to be that mother, whatever it is, for that wounded part of me. Mm-hmm. And of course, my wounded part is like eating it up. Yeah, I love it too. So I'm being, in my mind, being very vulnerable. We bond on that. Mm-hmm. And it's not that that's all bad. I'm not saying that's all wrong or bad, but that's the basis for the bonding. But an actual healthier relationship, right? And this is ideal, super ideal. None of us are completely there. But an ideal thing is that it's not my parts that my friend or my spouse or my girlfriend encounters. It's my inmost self. And that she's also, there's a process to like let our parts step back and be able to just be real, be honest, and come to that from that place of vulnerability that's genuine. And we come from that place. Sometimes we can talk about our parts. I can tell her about my wounded exiled guy. I can tell her about my other parts, right? And she can hear about that and empathize.
Yeah.
And then she's doing the same thing to me. So I'm encountering her core inmost self. So that's a spiritual connection. Now we're connected to each other on this deep spiritual level of really seeing the other person for who they are, for the beloved child that God made in them. That's profound and unbelievably, unfortunately rare, actually, but it can happen. Now, I'm presenting them as extremes, and I think what happens is we get glimpses of it sometimes, right? So people know what I'm talking about, but maybe they haven't experienced the fullness of it.
Yeah.
That's kind of the goal. Anyway, so how it shows up in relationship is complicated.
Yeah, no, to say the least. I mean, this is so insightful, and I know that some people might be thinking, man, there's kind of a lot to track with, or it might be overwhelming. But I think like when you put it in such plain terms, it's really helpful. And we definitely, like, thinking of my experience, there's certainly people in my life that like bring out a certain part of me, right? They maybe bring out the best in me or the worst in me, depending on who it might be. And so I think, we kind of see this in action in everyday life, even if we can't like quite put the words to it. And so, yeah, you use a lot of the language, like part of me, I've heard you say before, like, part of me wants to do this and part of me wants to do that. And so I think there's a simple understanding there. And everything you mentioned with kind of the task managers versus the firefighters makes so much sense too. I'm curious, you mentioned there's a process to kind of access that inmost self. I know we can't go deep into it, but would you tease that out a little bit for us of like, okay, yeah, like if you're, in a relationship or not in a relationship and you want to be, or you're looking towards marriage, it's like, man, I really want to make sure my true self or my inmost self, whatever you want to call it, is relating to this person's inmost self, but I'm kind of worried that that it's not, or the part of me is not. And so, yeah, if you could give us a little teaser there. I know, the book, I'm sure, goes deeper into this too.
Yeah. The book does actually like walk through that process to some extent, but I can give you a little glimpse of it. So first of all, we have to have the awareness, because I think most of the time, like, we're not aware, like, we just operate. And so we're not thinking about ourselves in this way. And so parts are blending in with the self or covering it up or whatever. And this just happens and we're not conscious of it. So the first step is to just even recognize, yeah, I have an interior world. I have an interior space that has some complexity. So if we may have to pause, right, and notice these different parts that are in me. And what's cool and interesting is there's different ways to access them, but one cool way is through the body itself, which is very hylomorphic if you're Thomistic, but is to like recognize that in our physical bodies, our parts do kind of sometimes manifest in some way, especially the parts that are disturbed or parts that are having some struggle. So one way is like when we're stressed about something, we will feel it in our physical body. So we notice, like, for me, it's my shoulders usually. So like I will do this with my shoulders, they'll tense up. And so to recognize, okay, if I pause for a moment and say, okay, my shoulders are tense, just have that awareness that I'm doing that, and be able to pause for a moment and say, okay, what part of me is connected to that tension, right? Because oftentimes I know for me that tension in my shoulders, at least, is probably that taskmaster on some level, worried that I won't be able to get everything done that I'm supposed to. That might be one example. And so I'm literally tensing, right, to be activated to do something, right? And yet at the same time, if I can't do anything, it's paralyzed and it's sort of stuck. So I'm noticing my body, connecting in with that master, and then, or man, I should give him a better name, but that doer, the doer part. So immediately right there, I'm noticing a part. And so as soon as I connect with a part, then I have created a little distance internally between me and that part. There's a space there. So I can notice it. It could even notice me, if you will, or notice other parts, but there's a little internal distance. It's not like he's not on top of me, he's just over here. And then as you kind of get to know that part and listen, kind of pay attention to it, I will often ask this question, like, how do I feel toward this part? All right, now something's going to show up. If something shows up that says, yeah, he's a pain in the butt, or he's no fun. Okay, oh, there's another part. Okay, so I've got a part that has an issue with that part of me. So there's an inner conflict that I have within me between, there's a part of me that wants to get everything done, and there's a part of me going, why can't you just relax? Why can't you chill out? We're going crazy over here. Okay, so within me, I have these two different parts that aren't in agreement. All right, if I can notice that part, okay, fine, notice you. Go back to the other part. How do I feel toward that part? See if something else shows up. And so what happens is you're sort of teasing out these different parts. Usually these parts have some agenda. At some point in this process, what you might feel toward a part is compassion or understanding, some level of patience, sense of calm, as even love, if you will, some sense of curiosity about it, not a judgment, not an agenda, not trying to make something stop or go or do anything. It's just these natural qualities, I think, related to faith, hope, and love, but related to, I think the biggest one is compassion, is the biggest, like, usual, there we are.
Yeah.
Now we've connected with our inmost self, right? Because the inmost self is just, it doesn't really have a big agenda other than maybe harmony, healing maybe, but it's not like trying to fix things. It is simply really an expression of, within us, of God is love, in a sense, right? Because that's God is love and we're in his image. So our inmost self expresses just this natural love. And it was discovered by Dick Schwartz, even, who's totally secular, and he was working with women who had eating disorders. Dick Schwartz, is the founder of Internal Family Systems. He created this sort of that way of approaching it in the 1980s. And he was working with women with eating disorders, and he figured out this process of getting them to connect with their parts. And once they teased out all these different parts, and to a person that he worked with, every woman that he worked with, suddenly this self, he just called it the self, emerged that was just naturally compassionate, naturally courageous in some ways and creative, but just had this natural beauty, if you will. And it didn't matter how terrible their trauma history was or how messed up their lives were. It was innate. So I really think he naturally stumbled upon the image of God in each human being in a natural level. It's there. So anyhow, so this is what this process is. What I've realized in time was, yes, it's psychological, and there's a psychological approach, arts work, but it's incredibly spiritual. And I'm like, and I was thinking to myself, well, if I believe that the Holy Spirit works through every human and dwells every, baptized, whatever Christian, then imagine what it would be like for the inmost self to fully express, be open to God's love and open to the Holy Spirit, open to the virtues of faith, hope, and love to then manifest throughout the whole system of the person. I was thinking, as Christians doing this, the transformation should be even more, right?
Wow.
Because it's like every need we have ultimately can be filled by our inmost self in communion with the Trinity.
Wow.
Communion, God, right? And so to me, this was all mind blowing. And as it was coming together and beautiful. And so this is, so much of the work that I do is this approach now.
So good. No, I could see why it's so effective too. And yeah, wow. No, I'm blown away. Well, just maybe let me try to summarize the process that you mentioned just for everyone listening and to see if I understood it. So essentially the first step of kind of getting to that inmost self is just being aware of maybe what parts may be coming out, if that's the right way of saying it, or just like they're active maybe. Mm-hmm. So there's something happening. That part is like stepping in, taking some sort of a role on. So identifying it, acknowledging it, bringing awareness to it. And then it sounds like engaging it in some sort of like simple dialogue, simple conversation of kind of understand, and which is meant to aim towards understanding. And ultimately the goal would be like some sort of compassion. And that would allow us to kind of quell maybe the concerns or the fears or whatever's bothering that part so that we can act from our inmost self. Is that somewhat it, or what did I miss?
No, that's great. I love that. I would just say that compassion isn't so much the goal, it's the beginning. And because then there's this process of unburdening the part, whatever burdens it's carrying, helping the part learn its true role in the system. And so then there's work to be done, but which is cool. And then there's interactions, it sounds funny, but between our different parts and having the whole system. So it's a little bit like an orchestra, right? The self is this conductor, right? Dick Schwartz has used this analogy, but it's a good one. And so if the self is sort of like the conductor, then, all the parts, you want to get them in tune and you want to get them all the instruments working, playing together, and they all have an important, the wind instruments and the brass instruments, and everybody has a role. And so when it's all together, it's beautiful. And I have then run with that and began to see how our inner world from a Christian perspective is very much like an inner temple or inner cathedral, if you will, or whatnot, that in fact, the inmost self is like the priest or the, I suppose, minister, but is the celebrant. And then we have all different roles. There's readers and this and that, and people in the congregation. Like our inner world ultimately is meant to be this worshiping community within us, that all of our parts then become oriented toward God and praising God. Then our system, where all of us, if you will, is loving back to God, if you will, worshiping back to God. So to me, again, there's this strong spiritual sense. I really draw on, to a great extent, when Christ says that we were to love God with our whole heart and everything, but we're to love our neighbor as ourself. And so I think that's a fascinating thing. And when you think about it, because we hate ourselves, then we're not loving, We're not loving others very well. So what does it mean to connect with all our different parts and help them be unburdened and help them be harmonious and all this business? Well, this is not all about narcissism or just self-focused kind of stuff. No, this is about loving ourselves properly. And when we do love ourselves properly, and when we do, it's always a work in progress, but as we do develop this harmony, we are able to love others so much better. We're able to turn to our girlfriend or boyfriend or spouse, whoever. We understand their parts better, so we give them a lot of grace, but they're seeing a different us, truer us, if you will. And so that is powerful. We're able to love others better. And ultimately, like I was saying before, love God fully.
Really powerful. And experience, like you said, more peace, more harmony, but more joy, more happiness, we would probably say too. And that's really beautiful. Quickly, before I move to the next question, I know you recently went to Italy, and I'm curious what part of you or parts of you came out in Italy? Because I've noticed for me, when I've gone over there, my grandparents came from Italy and moved to America, and so I just love Italy. But it brings out a different part of me than in America. So I'm just curious if you noticed that.
So I'd never been to Italy before, believe it or not. And so it was my first time in Rome. So I was in Rome, I was in Florence. Yeah, I mean, it was interesting. I don't know what to say. It's a little tricky. I think I had very different parts with reactions. Some of them surprised me. I found the city, pretty bustly in that, but I mean, a lot of big American cities are too. It was very aggressive. Like, I have just getting coffee or something. Like what was happening to me was realizing like, wow, I am not like how just being in a different cultural environment affects you and how helpless you are when you don't really know all the rules and you don't speak the main language. So there was a part of me that was super felt a little overwhelmed and helpless. Like I remember trying to get coffee and people jumping in front of me and this was in the morning and I was just like, okay, I don't know where I'm supposed to go and I don't know the process because they're doing it different than they would ever do it in a Caribou cafe. So there was some of that, and the other parts of me were like, it was interesting going to all the different. I went through, I think, 5 holy doors, which was super cool. But going to a place like St. Peter's, I was so excited to go to St. Peter's, and it was gorgeous. But I know I was going through with people going through it. I didn't go there for mass or anything, but I did feel a little bit like I was in a museum, and I love museums, so don't get me wrong. But I felt like something about that. I don't know, just felt like it was too much. I have a Benedictine spirit, but also a Franciscan spirit that loves the simplicity. So I was all excited, and then I felt a little overwhelmed also just by, I mean, I loved it, so don't get me wrong, but I felt a little bit like, oh, but where do I go to meet God? I would go, there was a few other places that actually surprised me, like even St. Paul, there was St. Paul's Basilica, that it was still grand and everything. But for some reason, I just felt more at home there. It felt more simple. It felt more something. And so I had different parts reacting a little bit to the spirituality. Yeah. Anyway, so I don't know if that's what you were looking at.
Yeah, no, it's helpful. No, and I was just curious that aspect of like going into a different culture. That's why I was asking this question and kind of your parts kind of being at play, because I think those situations when we're not in our normal environment, to me at least, kind of bring out parts of you that maybe aren't brought out very often. And I remember that, on my first trip, over there and going to different cultures too. Yeah, you're, especially ones where you don't speak the language, you're certainly at like in a vulnerable position, like you said. And I remember feeling exactly the same way. And then part of you maybe, I remember I would get like, even very like frustrated with myself. I'm like, wait, like, even like driving over there, there's been times when I've driven in Italy, and at first it was like actually a really stressful experience for me, because I'm like, I don't know how to pay the tolls. I don't know, like, how to do this and do that. And like everything I do in America, and I'm like, am I doing it right? Am I going to screw it up? So anyway, it's just an interesting analogy, if you will, of kind of how this all works. So thank you for answering that. Feel free to comment on any of that, but I wanted to transition a little bit to movies, because I think it's another great way of understanding parts work. And so I'm curious, if there's any movies top of mind for you that kind of exhibit these principles, exhibit this framework. A couple that come to mind to me that I wasn't sure if they fit here would be like Inside Out, Inside Out 2, Encanto. I've heard that there's some of this going on there, but you tell me, like, what movies would you say like exhibit this well?
I would say, I enjoyed all 3 of those movies. I thought Inside Out did a lot to help people understand parts. It's not like a perfect representation by any means, but to see the inner working of the main character, Riley, and her inner working, like with all the different, they were represented by emotions, but these emotions seem to have their own emotions too. So they were like little parts. And it made a lot of sense that people watch that film, and kids would, of course, watch that film, and it resonates. Even though parts can sometimes seem strange, sometimes when you're trying to explain it, the reality is that it really does resonate with most people. And Inside Out kind of proved that. So I think it does a great job of showing how there's complexity within. It does a great job of showing some inner conflicts that goes on within, and so on. I would say one thing I point out, what I was unhappy about Inside Out, was that I felt like there was no inmost self. There was no, that core spiritual center wasn't represented. Like to some extent, the Joy character did that, but not really fully. And so I felt like there was a missing piece. But what do you want? It's a Disney movie. It's not going to be. I can't expect it to fit all of my designs, but nevertheless, I felt like that was a missing piece that actually got addressed in Inside Out too. They actually did, imperfectly, but interestingly, showed there's that like constellation thing that changed color and it went out at one point, or it got thrown away, or got replaced by, and I thought, wow, that really does kind of show the spiritual center in some interesting ways. If on some level, the image of God within like that core center, it got overwhelmed, it got replaced at one point, but when it would filter down or whatever. So I thought Inside Out 2 did a great job of showing the spiritual dimension. And then, of course, the way they showed the anxiety character, and when he was out of control, or she, I don't know if it was a he or she, and it was like going, it was losing control, and it was trying to do everything, and you could see, and I thought, wow, that did a great job of showing fight or flight. Like what an amazing thing. So I feel like those two movies like really did a lot to like normalize parts. It also did a lot. It had a pretty good understanding of trauma, and of course it has a very strong understanding of how human emotions work.
Brilliant. Yeah, no, I love it. All those things. And yeah, one of the things that hit me in the second Inside Out was how, just we're all of our parts, right? It's not like we can like cut one part of us off and like throw it away and say, I'm kind of ashamed of that part. I don't want anything to do with it. But there needs to be this like you said before, like this harmony, this integration of even maybe the parts that we aren't crazy about. And so I thought that was neat too, how not to spoil it for everyone, but how the end result was kind of this, this harmony, I can't think of a better word, between the different parts of Riley.
Mm-hmm.
Encanto, I'm curious if you have thoughts on Encanto. It's such an interesting movie. I have almost a 3-year-old, almost 4-year-old, and so we watch a lot of these movies. But I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that one.
Yes, I do, and I have seen it, not recently, so I might not remember every name or every little aspect. I think that was brilliant. I actually saw it. My daughter, who's an adult, like my kids are all adults, but it was earlier on, like a number of years ago, my daughter wanted to watch it, and we watched it, and I half paid attention, I'll be perfectly honest. And I initially, like, maybe it's culture, like I'm not terribly familiar with that culture, and I wasn't clear on at first, like, what is it trying to say, and maybe I was just tired, so I got some of it. But then a few years later, like, I had somebody say, no, Gerry, you have to like pay attention. You need to like notice this movie better. So I said, okay, fine. And I was doing these film reviews. And everybody said, I have to look at Encanto. So I watched Encanto again, this time, like with my notepad. And I was like, well, and then of course the film is brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. What I would end up saying is a little bit there, which is interesting as I was reflecting on, okay, how does it all work, is that the main character,
Mirabelle, I think. Yeah.
Mirabelle, yes. At first I didn't get it right away, but I actually think she represents the inmost self. Mm-hmm. And that's why she doesn't have a gift. Mm-hmm. And because the inmost self isn't, like, the gifts are roles or functions that they all these different relatives have. And she doesn't have one. She's the heart of that family. Hmm. And at the end, when she comes in to open the door, she's the one that has to unlock the door, the house, in a way. Like, you could argue the house is, but the house is sort of, but it's more impersonal in a way than I think our innermost self actually is. So anyway, that, I don't know if that's, true, or just, I don't know if I could argue it in a court of law, but that's my impression. But the house is also interesting as the self system in some way too, or housing the self system. So I love that aspect. Yeah. And how the different characters, like, the character, I guess, would be her uncle, I think. Anyway, the character that was kicked away, that had to
Bruno,
castle. Yeah, Bruno. Yeah. So he was a perfect example of an exile. And who goes, nobody wants to go near him. And well, she goes in and risks it all to her death, but to find him. This is what the inmost self does. And this is to find that exile and bring that exile home. It's what Christ does as a good shepherd. He finds that sheep and he brings that sheep home. it was so, to me, that was so beautiful. That showed again this, I don't know, it fit very well with Park's work.
If you come from a divorced or broken family, or maybe you know someone who does, we offer more resources than just this podcast. Those resources include things like a book, free video courses, speaking engagements, a free assessment, online community, and much more. All of our resources are designed to help you heal from the trauma that you've endured and build virtue so you can break that cycle and build a better life. And so if you want to view those resources for yourself or someone that you know, just go to restoredministry.com/resources or click on the link in the show notes. Yeah, no, it's beautiful. That's what I wanted to talk to you about, some of these movies. One question about Encanto, then we can move on. The aunt that has wears her emotions on her sleeve, has all the weather, she controls the weather or whatever. What's your insight there? What's going on there? She basically, the way they exhibit her in the movie is that she really has not much control over how she reacts to her emotions.
Right.
If she gets angry or upset, then there's a tornado. If she, is sad, then there's a rainstorm. It's just, she kind of wears her emotions on her sleeve. She has very little what we might call emotional mastery. And so I'm curious, I think I've heard some people speculate kind of why that might be, but obviously it's all just speculation. So it's okay if it's a little bit too distant, but I'm curious.
I mean, it just sounds to me like this is a part that is overwhelmed by emotion. So when we were talking about that a little earlier, right? When a part is overwhelmed by emotion, and they're in the driver's seat, then you've got a person who is always emotionally volatile and unpredictable, right? And so in a way that might be more what she was doing. And I don't remember what plays out for her toward the end if they develop that. I don't.
Yeah, no, I think basically the way she manages her emotions is I think her husband is the one who kind of helps calm her. And yeah, I don't think there's not a ton of resolution to that particular character in the movie. Of course, the resolution for the family, of course, is that they kind of, instead of trying to be this perfect family, they kind of acknowledge and accept there's parts of us that are broken, and we're not this perfect family that we want maybe people to perceive us as.
Yeah, no, I was wondering maybe that character, I don't know, in some way learns to use that power more helpfully than just be reactive. Because that actually sounds a little bit like a firefighter. Right?
Yeah.
And so, but what her role is, she's not meant to be in the system, meant to always be that. But maybe that power is channeled in a more positive way would be what I would be looking for. Yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate all that. Any other movies that you would bring up that kind of exhibit parts works, and then we'll talk a little bit about some other ones.
Yeah, I would argue that almost any movie does. I can't help it. I'll say this, in writing my reviews, I haven't yet done Lord of the Rings, and I haven't yet done any of the Marvel Avengers movies. Because I'm writing these little reviews, and I'm often picking movies that have been around for a while, and that's fine. I want to get to doing more recent stuff once I get going. And I look at them from a Christian perspective and from a parts perspective. So almost any movie, if it's any good at all, has some aspect, because it's just so fundamental to who we are as a person. So I will just say this, if you take a movie like The Lord of the Rings, or it's a book, right? Of course, it's one of my favorites. But and you look at the first book was The Fellowship of the Ring, right? And so you've got all these different characters that are brought together. They're all different. So you've got Aragorn and Boromir as the humans, and then you've got the hobbits, and you've got Legolas the elf, and you've got Gimli the dwarf, and you've got Gandalf the wizard, and you have all these different parts, right, if you will, coming together toward some kind of goal. Now they get all separated at the end of it, at the end of the first part, but they're kind of representing all these different dimensions of humanity. I'd argue a lot of times many of them are at different points a kind of Christ figure, but in a way though, that could be a part that is taking on a Christ-like role, which is perfectly fine. You know what I mean? So there's a multiplicity that's inherent, and I think when we watch a film like The Lord of the Rings, and we see these different characters and how they are different, and yet how they do interact, one unconscious way in which we are moved and brought into is that our parts relate to that. At a deep level, we relate to that. So whatever movie you want to pick Star Wars. Let's just say the original first Star Wars New Hope movie. You've got your Luke Skywalker, you've got your Han Solo, you've got the droids, you've got the Princess Leia. They all have different roles. and they all worked, and they, in the movies, usually they reach a pitch as this team or whatnot works together more harmoniously or whatever, bonds, and to fulfill whatever. And so it's the same if you were to look at, like, say, the Avengers and the Marvel movies. Like, you were to say, okay, why does this even work for us on a deeper level? Why do we get excited about these teams? Is because, oh, they're all different. Whether it's Iron Man with his issues, and how many of us have an Iron Man within us, like a guy who's like invulnerable to everything, right, and whatever, but yet he struggles, right, to handle things sometimes. But how many of us also have a Captain America? Like, we've got a do-gooder part of us, right? And we've got a Hulk within us who rages. We've got, so you could go through it, like, all these different characters kind of represent parts of us. And that's why these movies, at a very innate level, like, speak to us. Yeah.
So good. Gosh, I'm excited to read more of those. I read a little bit of like one of them, but I'm really excited. And we'll make sure to link to that column on your website so people can follow and read through that. Just quickly here, is it fair to say that maybe people's favorite movies are movies that they just like, the parts of them just resonate the most with the like main character?
I think so. I think you have to identify. And I think that, if you think about, some really popular movies like Spider-Man, regardless of which Spider-Man you like, the Tom Holland or the Andrew Garfield or the reason you resonate on some level often is because there's a part of us, right, that feels like no one, like that we don't matter, that we're somewhat orphaned, that life is hard. Peter Parker and Spider-Man, like, I guess he is orphaned. He lives with his aunt. He has girl problems. He has, job problems. He has problems at school. He's being bullied. Like, all these different things are happening to him. And I think that we relate, there's a part of us that really relates to that kind of character. And yet he's a superhero. He discovers powers that he didn't, that he gets. He discovers abilities. And yet he, in his case, like, he also, like, has to figure out how he wants to exercise that for good, ultimately. But isn't that how we all feel? Like, don't most of us feel like an awkward, nerdy whatever at times, and growing up in the world's against us, and yet at our brightest moments, like, we discover truly who we are, and that's greater than we thought. And I think so many of the characters that we relate to, we have those interconnections with.
I love that. My favorite movie is actually Batman Begins, and I kind of noticed, I didn't even realize it until later, after seeing it as like a kid and realizing, like, oh my goodness, there's like similarities. Obviously I'm not a billionaire, but there's similarities with kind of Bruce losing his parents, how I felt I kind of lost my parents, and things like you said. So good. There's so much more we could talk about. We're close to the end of our time. I do want to ask a couple more questions, if that's okay. I want to briefly touch on mother wounds, and kind of similarly with movies, I've noticed in all the movies my daughter and I are watching, like Cinderella or Rapunzel's movie Tangled, Sleeping Beauty, Snow White, like there's always like this kind of villainous female. And I'm curious, just talking with you about mother wounds, I remember we had a conversation like a year ago about this really briefly, and it stuck with me, and I was like, I need to talk to them more about that. So I'm curious, like, for everyone listening, like, what are mother wounds, and how do they affect people? And if you want to use any examples from movies, feel free.
Well, so a mother wound, in a sense, like a father wound, is where something happens, usually right in childhood, where our natural needs, our needs for maternal care and maternal nurturing, get disrupted in some way, right? And there are all kinds of possibilities there. Sometimes it's obviously the parents, your mother in this case, like their own woundedness or their own blocks or whatnot, their own trauma or whatnot gets resurfaces in some way, and they act out something negative, right? Or it's, sometimes it can even be something out of that person's control, right? Like, your mother, has a miscarriage or something and goes into a depression or dies even, right? And it's not in her, the mother wouldn't have wanted that, right? But so a child experienced that as a wound, right? As a loss. But then a lot of times the mother wound is where the mother actively, in some ways, unaffirms, unnurtures, like fails in some way, right? In that more active way, out of whatever brokenness. And so, recognizing a little bit, I'm going to make this so simple. It's way more complex, but I'm going to make this so simple. What we need from our fathers is affirmation. We need a lot more, but I'm going to, nutshell it a little bit, is affirmation. What we need from our mothers is nurturing. And so not that fathers don't nurture and not that mothers don't affirm. There's something essential in that, and there's sort of a core thing. There's nothing like being nurtured by your mom.
100%.
Dads can't quite do it the same, or some other caregiver isn't quite the same. And so, I mean, well, we can have a substitute mom, like an adopted mom or something, and it can be just perfect. But there's nothing like that. And so when a mother is angry, cold, or whatnot, it's really difficult. The movie that stands out for me, that maybe it's so old that nobody has seen it, but is Ordinary People. It came out. Yeah, it's powerful. Don't watch it. Like, if it's like, it's literally like Schindler's List. Like, don't watch it if you're in a bad like unless you're ready to cry, kind of thing. But it's a movie, won Best Picture, actually, I think in like 1980 or 81. And it stars Donald Sutherland, who recently passed away, and Mary Tyler Moore, and they're the parents. It was shocking because Mary Tyler Moore had a show in the 1970s where she was, everybody was in love with her. I was a kid. I was in love with her. Like, she's so nice, such a lovable character. And before that, she was the wife on the Dick Van Dyke Show, and everybody was in love with her there. But in Ordinary People, she's as cold as ice, and she plays it perfectly. And in this case, you've got the dad is like some lawyer or some job that makes a lot of money, and the wife's a stay-at-home mom, and they're in some kind of like fancy, I don't know, upscale Connecticut or somewhere type, like upper middle class kind of thing. And they have two sons, an older son and a younger son, and the two sons go out on a boating trip, and they're older teenagers, and one of them drowns, the older one, and the younger one survives. And the older one was the football star. The one who died was this sort of like ideal kind of like perfect son, so to speak. And the younger one was the more awkward, quiet, shy one. And the mother her own grief was such that she completely hated, like wouldn't outwardly say it, but she was completely hateful to the younger son.
Wow.
Because she couldn't handle her own grief in losing the one son, and on some level blamed him also in some way. Not that he caused the accident, but she just held on to it. She couldn't resolve her own issues to love her son the way he desperately needed his. And then the father was loving, the father was super kind and unbelievably great, but because of this mother wound, this kid was really in part because the kid was suffering because he was grieving the loss of his brother in the accident. So, but this movie, I won't say more, but I mean, it shows depression, like the boy's depression, shows grief. There's even a counselor involved in the process there. It's a powerful, powerful movie. And to me, it took me by surprise to see Mary Tyler Moore play this unfeeling mother. And the crazy thing is the actress, Mary Tyler Moore, had lost her son to suicide, I think, a year before.
Wow.
So anyway, analyze that. I'd be curious. But so that's the movie. But just to say something, I don't know if you want to comment on that.
No, I'm just taking it all in. That's just fascinating, and it's so helpful to see, like, especially in like a story, because I think a lot of people can relate to that more than the kind of theory of it. So thank you for doing that. Yeah, I'm just more curious now about as one of the last questions, like how that typically affects people, and if you have any tips for kind of maybe beginning that process. Like, obviously therapy with someone like you would be a great next step, but I'm curious how it affects people and what they can do about it.
I think that what happens is we unconsciously go to seek out what we don't have. And so again, I look at it as a part. We have a part, and often, like when we're young, we had, say, a mother wound some kind, and when we're young, we're not well equipped to cope. Like as an adult now, we could handle certain things better, right? But when we're younger, we don't know. We don't have many ways. So we look for ways to cope. So for example, like one way, if a boy experiences a pretty terrible mother wound, then either just all kinds of different ways that somebody could respond to that. But one way would be to be always looking for that mother nurturing in other women. So sometimes they become like over focused on, like womanizing to win over women to prove in some psychological way, like they're having to compensate. But also it can turn into like a type of hatred of women because they're holding so much anger toward their mother that then it turns into a hatred toward all women. And it's not always on the surface, right? It's not always the obvious person, but it can show up, right? All this anger there. And again, it's like a part of that person is like angry at women now. So it can show up in men who are abusive toward women, mistreat women, who, because they have all this underlying anger, they might not even be connecting the dots, right? For women, it could also be like not having that female connection means they might disconnect from their own feminine nature because their mother was not safe and or was threatening or whatever, or abandoned or something. And so they therefore internalize that as a rejection of themselves and their own womenness. So this could mean different things, right? For a woman to either want to be a man or to seek out relationships with women, instead of the opposite sex. I'm not saying that's the reason this happens for everybody, but it's a possible dynamic. And so, again, a hatred of self in that case. For one, like a man might hate women on some unconscious level, and a woman might hate herself, therefore, on some unconscious level because she's been rejected or hurt by her mother.
So good. There's so much there, and we'll have to cut it and maybe do a part 2 on all of this. But thank you for going into that. And I think if nothing else, it brings an awareness. And so, if someone is interested in learning more from you, because you're brilliant, thank you so much for doing this. What do you offer? I know you have the book, and there's other offerings, like you do therapy as well. So please tell us about all of that and how people could get it.
So yeah, the book would be great. Read that. We'll explain parts work in much more detail and all from a Christian perspective. Soulsandhearts.com, or Souls and Hearts is an apostolate. It's a project that Dr. Peter Malinowski and I do, and there's online communities. This whole ministry is about helping people learn about their inner parts and grow and heal. And it's not therapy, but it's often done in community, and there's a lot of education. There's a lot of things to learn there. There's so much. So we have online communities, but on that site are my columns. I have the Parting Thoughts column is my movie, film, and media review. And Kingdom Within is another column that I do that is all about like incorporating deep Christian philosophy and theology and connecting it to a part psychology. And so again, looking at the history, like what different saints or different early church writers and so on have said, and showing how that supports in a way this whole version, this understanding of the human person. So there's that, and also there's other resources, and so there's Souls and Hearts, and then Transfiguration Counseling .co is my practice site. I am not so much seeing new clients, but I have a whole team of therapists who all of them are using parts work, but they all have different talents and skills, and they're all faith-oriented therapists. So, and we're in different states, in multiple states, not all the states, but we're in quite a few. So
beautiful. Thank you for all that. And no, what you're doing is revolutionary. And if someone's interested, especially on the therapy side, because we've gotten a lot of interest, people asking like, oh, where do I go for therapy? Do most of your therapists offer like a free consult if they wanted to do that?
They don't usually offer a free whole consultation. I mean, they might do a 15-minute phone call to talk about it, to see if it's a good fit, that kind of thing. Yeah. And if you call our main number, we have a therapist who takes in all those calls. He does a 15-minute, and his job is to figure out who the best person is for that person, and to also just understand. And he's a therapist, so he's under confidentiality, and he's wonderful. His name is Kevin.
Love it. No, that sounds like an amazing next step for anyone who's been wanting to do therapy but wasn't sure where to go. I'd recommend it as well. So thank you for coming on the show. It's been great to have you. I just want to give you the final word. What final encouragement or advice would you leave everyone with, especially the young people listening right now who come from broken families?
Well, whatever hurt and pain that you've experienced, I would just say to bring that and notice that can be united with Christ's suffering. So you're not alone in your pain and suffering. Yeah, there are lots of other people that also have experienced pain and suffering, of course, but in Christ, he unites with you in your suffering, and he can transform. And so there can become meaning. Whatever pain and suffering you've experienced was not necessarily meant to be or anything, but it can be transformed into something meaningful. And so to allow that process to happen takes a lot of courage, but I would just encourage people to do that, and to recognize that your prayer life can be a lot deeper than, saying prayers like out loud, or just that a prayer life can be about looking inside. And as we do that, recognizing how beautiful you are at the level of your soul, and how as you look inward, as you connect in with God, it raises you up. So there's an interior exploration that leads to an ascent. So I will just leave you with that.
I learned so much in that interview, yet there's so much more I wish we could have talked about, we could have covered. And so I have a request. If you want Dr. Gerry to come back, submit a question for him. I'll tell you how to do that in a second. But if we get enough questions, we'll get him back on the show to talk more about mother wounds and to answer your questions. So you can submit a question by clicking the link in the show notes or going to restoredministry.com/ask. Again, restoredministry.com/ask, or just click the link in the show notes. That wraps up this episode. If this podcast has helped you, feel free to subscribe or follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube. You'll avoid missing future episodes and help us reach more people too. And if you've already done that, feel free to rate or review the show. We appreciate that feedback, and that also helps people find the podcast as well. In closing, always remember, you are not doomed to repeat your family's dysfunction. You can break that cycle and build a better life, and we are here to help. And keep in mind the words of C.S. Lewis, who said, you can't go back and change the beginning, but you can start right where you are and change the ending.